It's really fantastic to be here. It's evening time here in Melbourne, and we're also heading into winter. And I hope you're all good, whichever part of the world you're in, and understand you're all online in terms of your teaching still. So, I mean, we are really all in challenging times. And I'm just very honoured to be invited and pleased to be able to speak this evening as part of the festival. So thank you very much, Associate Professor Zainab, Head of Department of Interior Architecture and Environmental Design, for the invitation, and also to Dr. Ferrer for her assistance over the past few months in terms of lots of emails and backwards and forth. So I'm very pleased and looking forward to all your questions as well. So please make sure. It's always good to have a good discussion at the end, and everyone always has the same kinds of questions, so it'd be good to be brave and ask some questions.
Thank you. Before giving the word to Suzie Attiwill, I would like to briefly introduce her. Dr. Suzie Attiwill is Associate Dean in Interior Design, School of Architecture and Urban Design, RMIT University, Melbourne. Since 1991, her practice has involved exhibition design, curatorial work, writing, and teaching. Projects pose questions of interior and interiority in relation to contemporary conditions of living, in habitation, subjectivity, pedagogy, and creative practice. And research is conducted through practice of designing, attending to arrangements of spatial and temporal and material relations. Her recent publications include Interior Designing in the Urban Environment, Urban Interiors and Interiorities, A New Image for Interior and Interiority, Urban Interiority as Collective Individuation. Now, I would like to give the word to Suzie Attiwill for her speech.
Thank you very much. So I'll just share my screen, if that's okay, to begin the talk. So yeah, I hope you can all see that, and just someone sing out if you can't. So this talk tonight, or your daytime, presents some of my current thinking and practice around urban interiority. And I'm right in the middle of a Master's of Interior Design studio called Urban Interiority. And so many of the ideas that I'm going to be sharing and discussing with you here are coming right in the middle, of this development with students as we experiment around this concept through practice and ideas. I guess from the bio that Zainab read out, I have a really deep commitment to interior design as a critical 21st century discipline and practice. And I use the term interior design rather than interior architecture, because I like to sort of have an emphasis on the word design as a verb and not only a noun. And so really sort of through interior design, posing this question of designing interiors. And certainly interior architecture and interior decoration and other practices aligned with that have then become part of this kind of proposition around designing interior. And I have this term that I like working with called interiorist. So this idea that we're, an interior designer is an interiorist, and that interior design is a practice of interiorization. So hopefully these sort of ideas and concepts will become a bit clearer as I talk through some of these ideas. But look, I'd sort of also like just to begin by addressing the brief for the Design Festival and sort of linking my ideas into what you've been thinking about for the past couple of days. So just around breaking boundaries and exploring design approaches in a changing world. And I guess, this is a kind of provocative title, really, the idea of breaking boundaries, especially at a time when we're retreating into our domestic realm and to isolate and retreat from the exterior world. And I'm very much reminded of the writings of the early 20th century philosopher Walter Benjamin, because he's quite famous for sort of coining the term interior in relationship to this idea of the bourgeoisie interior. And he was talking about it in the sort of in relationship to the industrial city, and how sort of every, like there was the public realm, which was the city, and industry, and that people retreated into the security and comfort of their interior, of their domestic environment. I'll just move to this next slide, if I can. So, of course, we always, there we go. So just this idea of breaking boundaries, this is just from a first year design studio in the bachelor's, and I guess it's just there as a way of sort of making proposition about how we think about boundaries even to begin with. So now as we're entering the third decade of the 21st century, you know, we do have a very different city as exterior and also interior conditions from what Walter Benjamin was writing about in relationship to his idea of the concept of interior. But I think it's, you know, as I was saying, it's just, you know, it's quite interesting how we're sort of almost feels like we've retreated back to that time and just have this, due to COVID, and have this idea of sort of the home as security and comfort. But at the same time, it's not the same thing really, is it? I mean, even tonight, you know, or today, your time, I mean, you know, that we might be sitting in our homes, or here I am sitting in at RMIT University for the first time. You know, we came back in March, but we were online all of last year. And so, you know, the virtual has really kind of changed, and digital technologies completely changed what this interior-exterior dynamic is. And so, you know, it's really great to be exploring this through the Design Festival. And I think that it's sort of really current to experiment with this in relationship to the pandemic, but also the environmental kind of crises that we're facing. So in this talk, I'm want to sort of just put this out here, like as a proposition and a provocation around breaking boundaries. And, you know, this idea of, again, from the Design Festival's brief, defining our life limits, which is a phrase I like a lot. And so with my own work, you know, I really question this idea of just the assumptions around interior as space to begin with, and also as a container, like inside architecture. And also the concept of interiority, which is often equated with the idea of an individual and psychological, you know. And so just as I've indicated here, I hope you can see my mouse or my fingers, you know, like just over the course of this talk, just want to move them across to other sorts of ideas and ways of thinking about interior and interiority. So I guess the question also is really, why do we want to break these boundaries of interior as space and container, interiority as individual and psychological? And also the kind of emphasis on human too, I think is something that you know, I'm keen to also break boundaries with. And it's, you know, the kind of the implications of these in our kind of contemporary 21st century environment, really. And so things that come in and particularly around, say, interiority as individual and psychological, are things like capitalism. And, you know, there's a lot that's being said and written about how capitalism has this individualizing kind of force, and that makes, you know, us all feel like we're sort of enclosed individuals. And while that has sort of positive aspects, it also has negative aspects in terms of sort of isolating people from each other. And, you know, it leads on to notions of individualism and sort of mental health and all these, you know, like things that connect in with thinking around that. And then I think also this kind of idea of separating our interior from an exterior, as though, you know, it's a sort of dialectic, or a, you know, we've only got the inside and then we've got the outside, rather than seeing them, say, more in a relational condition, is sort of, you know, that things like the environment and relations with the environment, and climate change and the Anthropocene, you know, we just tend to have the interiors kind of retreat from that. Whereas I guess my proposition is that it can be a really kind of critical position from which to rethink exteriors and the way that we are in the world. Anyway, So this idea of needing to redefine our life limits, I think, is a really great provocation from the festival. And so, yeah, I think it's exciting. But tonight, or today, sorry, it's mainly going to be looking at cities. And so this is just a photograph of Tokyo. It's not one that I took, but, it's like, I suppose this was cities kind of pre the pandemic. And so 2019, before 2020, and the pandemic hit. And, like cities have been sort of really kind of key global world kind of phenomena, really, for human beings. And particularly in the 21st century, the United Nations have defined the 21st century as the century of the city. And that's because it's just a time of significant change and in urban environments and cities. And so, like things that have happened is just a huge increase of influx of people moving into cities and living in cities. But now, like so interesting, I think, just with the pandemic, and perhaps a positive sort of aspect of it is just the pause that's put on what's been happening in cities. It's like, Melbourne, I'm very conscious that Melbourne is kind of quite a different situation at the moment from many other cities around the world. And, we have in the Masters of Interior class, some students online from Delhi and other Indian cities, and particularly Delhi at the moment. I mean, it's really in a kind of crisis state as a city. But there's just, like Melbourne is slightly different. It's like it's just had this big pause when for almost a year, no one was in the city because there were significant lockdowns. And, the city was just completely desolate. But I'll come to that. But I suppose, just coming back to how cities kind of, and in my writing, I look back to a couple of years and, like it's sort of, you read it and go, oh, well, it's all sort of changed since then. But that's what's so interesting is that, it's really the first time in history that there's more people living in urban environments and rural contexts. And that's still the kind of case, even though I suppose, what's happened is people living in those cities, if they've been able to, they've sort of moved into their suburban sorts of areas, but we think of the city as that kind of larger environment. And so it's just really interesting. It's the first time in history. So it's, 55%. And then it's projected by 2050 that there's going to be 68% of people living in cities. And it's also, that's got to be coupled with how many people there are in the world. And just an interesting statistics is that 1950, the total urban population was 751 million people. And in 2018, this was 4.2 billion. And so, like just people, which is what interior designers work with, is people in their habitats, in their living environments. This becomes a sort of really key issue of how people inhabit and live in cities. I suppose there's lots of other things that are kind of critical with cities, like displacement. People being displaced from their countries, and something like 70.8 million people being forcibly displaced, and there's 25.9 million refugees, over half under the age of 18. And I know that you had a keynote lecture. The first lectures, that was looking at refugees as well. And there's something like 10 million people who are stateless. So there's a lot of people that are not sort of kind of in the cities that they live, also have this sense of home, and they're, being denied their basic rights. But also kind of critically, cities are places, or have been, one of the big things that's sort of changed is in terms of, this is photograph of Bangalore. And this is, like just cities pre-COVID, right? I'm just kind of painting a bit of a picture, but so this is Amsterdam, and tourism was just such a huge kind of problem for the city of Amsterdam, or becoming a really huge problem. And in 2019, tourism was the fastest growing economic sector in the world. the impact of this on various different cities was sort of massive, you know, like tidal flows of people coming in and going out. And I remember reading something about Amsterdam, like a news article that sort of spoke about the tourists being a bit like rats, you know, they're just everywhere. And you sort of get this sense of just how they're just kind of overpopulating here, what is the red light district in Amsterdam. And also with Venice, you know, the local population is only 60,000 people, but they have 20 million, or did have 20 million people as tourists annually. So, you know, in another city that has significant tourism in 2019. So this is a photograph of La Ramblas, and this is a photograph that was taken during 2020. So, you know, just this impact of the pandemic then on cities, on city life, and economically, socially, environmentally, it's been really, really significant. And this is a photograph that I rather like. This is one of how the market in Myanmar, in Burma, has been sort of reorganized so that there's kind of COVID safe protocols in place. So in terms of cities, you know, like there's obviously a lot to think about and to address. And what I would normally sort of be kind of focusing on, and I think this is still kind of relevant when we're thinking about cities, but it's just what's increasingly happening in terms of large architectural spaces that are, you know, with large interiors. That, you know, this is the kind of famous plaza in Korea or in South Korea by Zaha Hadid. And so really, you know, there's kind of this tendency a little bit, one could argue, about the interiorization of life into sort of large architectural interiors. And people like Mark Pimlott that you might have come across. I mean, he's an academic in Delft, TU Delft. And he's really addressing this as a really important thing that architects and architecture students have to learn, is how to address these large architectural interiors, which are going to, he's sort of saying, are going to become sort of the mainstay for how people live out their urban life as it's sort of moved into an inside environment protected from the various kinds of climatic conditions and things that are increasingly becoming evident, but also how, you know, it's organized in a way so that things like from a capitalist point of view are all at hand. Another interesting person, you know, another interesting kind of way of thinking about cities too is through the work of Liam Young, who describes himself as a speculative architect. And he's kind of done, he does a lot of kind of installation, filmic, performative works, giving lectures with films. You may know his work very well. But talking about how that data shapes our urban environment, and that it's not buildings in space as such anymore. And he gives a lecture film performance called City Everywhere, a storytelling tour through the landscape of technology, and where he presents a quasi-fictional city in the near future where the built environment is totally dissolved by technologies and automation to become a digital infrastructure. There's also, you know, like things where there's other speculative architecture. This was a proposal for, you know, the idea of a whole city having to be enclosed, you know, like in order to actually for inhabitants to survive what's happening externally in terms of the external environment. And I suppose, you know, like what I tend to work with and what I'm interested in exploring, and you know, there's sort of not images that I can show of this in some ways, because I guess it's kind of moving to, and I mean there will be, but it's kind of experimental at this stage, and that's what we're doing in the master studios. But is this proposition from, you know, again, Felix Guattari is a philosopher of the 21st century, he's no longer alive, but he's written kind of books like three ecologies, and this essay called Ecosophical Practices in the Restoration of the Subjective City. And I feel like the things that he's raising, I mean, he really pushes back on capitalism and saying that, you know, we've just got to find a way of sort of how we can attend to our social, physical and also mental ecologies. And this is interesting because it comes back to the provocation of the festival too, about life limits. And so he calls for a collective reorientation of human activities and really focuses on this idea of urban mentalities. And it's kind of like, you know, what does that mean? It's not, you know, like it's not, there's not something that's really clear about what that means and how we can think about it. And, you know, it's sort of a provocation in the sense of going, well, a subjective city, I mean, it's thinking about a city that kind of attends to the mental qualities of how people live in that city. And by mental, it's not saying, you know, it's people's brains and, you know, their emotions and things, but it's you know, it's things such as, you know, it could be senses of kind of culture and senses of a sense of well-being, of safety, ways of living, different sorts of relations that can be made to the exterior world. And I think a big one of this urban mentality is kind of going, well, how do we make new relations with the world around us, you know, that does not lead to this idea of we're just going to have to create bunkers to live in order to survive. And, you know, like, it's just, I find it really interesting from an interior design point of view, because he talks about new styles of living. And that for me is something very much kind of connect. Oh, I've got to wave my arms because the lights go off here when it gets dark. Sorry. But new styles of living. So lifestyle, you know, like, and this idea of styles is not just a sort of aesthetic. Well, aesthetics very important actually to Guattari, but it's, you know, ways and modes of living. And we have to attend, you know, that's what's really important to attend to. And critically here, this idea of production of subjectivity. And so that doesn't mean sort of manipulating people's individual emotions and you know, their subjectivity necessarily. I mean, that's what can happen, but it is understanding that there are people, and then there's kind of subjects and subject positions. So I'll show you some examples from the studios we've been working with. I might have to go a bit faster. I always talk too much, and I just find it's also interesting where he talks about this idea of urbanists can no longer be satisfied defining cities in spatial terms. So it's no longer enough to be talking about a city in terms of, you know, like we've got space and then we've got buildings and then we've got people, we've got transport. Rather, it's this idea of having to think about the production of subjectivity and new styles of living. And it's just, you know, as a way of moving into this without it being, you know, like, it kind of needs to just reframe and reconceptualize how we approach these questions and experiment with it. It's not just a kind of the next stage in some kind of evolution of design. It's really a repositioning. And I think it's just interesting to put together, say, someone like Le Corbusier, you know, and his way of envisaging a city, the modern city, based on, you know, the grid and the idea of sort of that people would live in apartments and that they'd be raised off the ground, that they could, you know, that below them there would be the parks and environments. And it was sort of very much around this idea, well, that, you know, man, you know, sort of rational man sort of lives life in a straight line. And so, you know, so should the cities be arranged in this kind of way. And I suppose I just wanted to show you these to counterpose, you know, like just as a kind of, again, a sort of conceptual proposition, but this is constant from, you know, like who is a situationist, or kind of always fought that term a little bit, but in the 1950s. And he had this extraordinarily different idea of what a city could be, which was called New Babylon, which he imagined could be a set of infrastructures that could be sort of put out across all cities around the world. And so this is his proposition for Amsterdam. And it would be a place that people could sort of move through the city into interiorized spaces like this and sort of have a sense of individual freedom and expression with what they would do. And it was sort of a place of energy instead of the kind of organized, rationalized lines and gridded lines of Le Corbusier. So, you know, this is just a kind of proposition of going, okay, well, there's these different ways of thinking about cities from this point of view. And, you know, like it was just very much this idea of it was all really about movement and time as well. And you're probably familiar with this idea, you know, like the wonderful diagram that the situationists did around the idea of what a city could be. And the situationists, you know, very interesting to think in relationship to urban interiority, because they experimented in the urban environment with what an interiority could be. And for them, you know, like they wanted to array a whole lot of techniques to resist capitalism's forces. And the way, you know, this, what I was saying at the very beginning, the way that these forces sort of internalized people and into a sort of, you know, autonomous individual subjectivity. And instead, their experiments were, you know, they're very Marxist and they're very interested in the proletariat and the worker, and how through their experiments that they did, that they could somehow arrive at, you know, rather than an individual subjectivity, that there could be some kind of objectivity they could arrive at that would really push back on what they saw was this increasing dominance of capitalism in terms of people's lives. So things like, you know, derive, like going on a derive through the city, psychogeography, you know, thinking about how the geography and topography of cities sort of had a psychological kind of impact, and also other practices like Dichotomy, which was, you know, a sort of rearranging and a kind of, a sort of manipulation of existing kind of spectacles and so on. And then this is a book that I was involved with back in 2011, so quite a while back. But we had this group called Urban Interior, and you know, it was about starting to think about how interior design could move out into the urban environment. Well, it was for me. I mean, there's others that were involved with this project who were architects and landscape architects and a range of, you know, other different practices. But it was sort of, we were kind of together with thinking about, well, what does urban interior mean and how can we think about that in the urban environment? And my particular chapter around that was techniques for an urban interiorist. And I was just really interested, and I still am, in terms of proposing, you know, what are the interior design techniques that can move out into the urban environment with the view that they're kind of critical in relationship to addressing this relationship between people and the environment in terms of how they live. Because, you know, the International Federation of Interior Architects and Designers, they have a definition of the practitioner, the interior design, interior art practitioner, as somebody that determines the relationship between people and space in relationship to physical and psychological parameters to improve the quality of life. And, you know, like while there's things that I'd sort of kind of unpick and you know, redefine it in some way, I think it's so interesting that you know, they talk about it as addressing the relation, you know, like, and it's not sort of defining it as somebody that's practicing inside a space, but really it's attending to this relation. And it's not even necessarily about the production of an artifact then. Interior designers don't necessarily kind of produce an artifact, but rather this kind of thinking about and making relations. So just with the time that I have left, and just really aware that it's, you know, less than 15 minutes now, but I think I've sort of discussed the kind of the conceptual underpinnings in a way, like, and now I want to just have a look at a series of studios that I've offered, and just to sort of explore this juxtaposition as it moves from urban and interior to urban interiority, because the latest studio, well, actually the one before that too, is sort of has moved from this idea of thinking of urban interior to urban interiority. And that's part of how I'm seeing also the nature of the kind of criticality of the question for interior design practice in the 21st century. So, you know, like this was, I was just invited to run a workshop, and these two workshops that follow, this one and the next one, you know, they were just a week-long workshop. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, because it was really, you know, very quick, relatively. The one that I'm running at the moment is sort of 15 weeks, and we meet every 6 hours, not every 6 hours, once a week, every 6 hours. And but yeah, this was at the Milan Polytech, and it was a master's workshop of interior design around looking at this issue of urban interior. And you know, this is a group of interiorists that were there for that period of time. And I chose a particular site for us to work in, excuse me, which was a relatively new square that had been, you know, like a square that had been built in Milan. And, you know, if anyone knows Milan, I mean, it's full of very old buildings and old, extraordinary urban fabric. And so this was quite interesting, this new building, new square at this time. And this is just a render of it. And so, you know, we chose to make this proposition to think about how can interior design move into this urban square, which is really like a plaza. It's not totally enclosed. And that was really important, because often urban interior projects identify sort of spaces that are the obverse of the inside. So, you know, it's kind of like, well, we've got a nice square, and can sort of, you know, make that into a dining or a living area. And that's really great. But I was sort of interested again in these sort of pushing the boundaries and saying, well, what are the interior design techniques that get brought into this? So this is the actual environment. You can see it's really, at that time, it was pretty new and pretty desolate as well. And this is the Duomo, which is also in Milan, and there's lots of pigeons there and things. And I mean, that's what's so extraordinary about here, is that absolutely no pigeons. So the pigeons didn't really even like being there. And so this was the proposition that was put to the students. And one of the key things that I ask students to do in the workshops is really to not to do a site analysis, but to move it to a situation analysis. And so in that, it's sort of moving from something that might be understood as more of an architectural approach and thinking about, well, what is the site, and, you know, what are its kind of parameters and the measurements, and, you know, identifying the materials and so on. Whereas a situation analysis is much more, I mean, it's that, but it's also about, well, what's the atmosphere, you know, different times of day, who's there, you know, like just really understanding a situation, and that you know, a site has many, many different situations over periods of time. And so this really brings the question of time and temporality, not only space, into the kind of consideration. And so, you know, these are some of the very, you know, it's just a week, and they sort of came up with some propositions in relationship to to bring interior design practices and interior into this environment. And so, you know, the students sort of proposed the idea of, well, let's just kind of transform that environment through introducing a fabric and something that really sort of transformed the nature of the concrete and things that people were engaging with. And then another one was going to bring in being attentive to the sensory qualities. And so orchestrating that in and around the plaza. And another student with this really interesting project, it's a little bit small here, but it was about how can you meet the rain and have an encounter with rain. And this was an industrial design student who did the workshop. And for her, it was about actually, because it was freezing cold all the time. And it was like sort of how, you know, to design a cup and to you know, have this moment where you could stand and hold the cup, and there was this sense of kind of an interior quality. And I guess this just led to this journal, and with a number of colleagues who are there at the Polytech Milano, and this is online, and Zenop's mentioned that many of you have sort of been working with questions of urban interior and so on, so maybe you've already come across this, but it's free to download and everything. It's you'll find it, I think, quite easily by Googling that. And then this was a very nice project that was included. It wasn't part of the Milan workshop, but Marti Guiget is a close colleague of Luciano Crespi, and so this was brought in. And this is a wonderful project, I think, in terms of urban interiority. And this is just a big solar kitchen and a restaurant. So if you can see just down here, it's people sitting around having dinner, and you can see their shadows here. And here's the solar sort of discs in order to cook the food that's just here. And there's sort of nice stories about how people wanted to smoke. They weren't told to, but they'd sort of get up and step outside the white, and go, so that was the kind of border that was there. And then just onto this project, which was a really fantastic workshop that I was invited to participate by Özge Gordon at the Istanbul Technical University. And I don't know if she's online here or some of the students are, but if you are, hello. And yeah, this was an invitation to participate in this master's workshop. And again, it was I think just over a week, but it was situated in Cyprus, Nicosia, and really addressing here, as the graphic shows, like the buffer zone that's there between the two parts of Cyprus divided into Turkish and Greek Cyprus. And this is the buffer zone that runs through here. So it's quite an extraordinary project and workshop to be involved. There were a number of different workshops, but the one that I offered with Özge was on urban interiority. And you can sort of just see, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but I think it's a wonderful kind of photograph of Nicosia and just the buffer zone that goes through. And we did a project in the Turkish area of Nicosia that was situated in this car park that was here. And we had a group of 13 students, and that we divided up into different groups to do different scenarios. But addressing this car park, which we identified, as just being a good kind of situation in which for the students to address this proposition of urban interiority. And so, as I was saying, they were involved. They were asked to do this situation analysis of this car park. And this is them doing, like some of the students doing the situation analysis at different times at night. And this is a nice diagram that one of them did. And so you can sort of see how, in terms of thinking about the situation, it moves beyond what the site conditions are to be thinking about the sound of the rooster and the bells and dogs and bats and crickets. And this to be just becoming part of like the larger sort of thinking of actually what is happening in the situation, in the place that they're working in. And this was just another watercolor that was in response to this. And then, a series of meetings, and you can see Özge here. And with the students, and this was somebody who was involved in, who we bumped into, or Özge bumped into, and like invited him to come along and talk to us. And so some of the students' projects here were dealing with history and thinking about how, because it's such a, and you probably all know much better than me, but Nicosia is so, like its history is so complex. And I guess we went into this with thinking about ideas of reunification and how this studio and thinking about urban interiority could actually make propositions to how that might happen in the future. And so students, responded to that. This group of students were interested in looking at history and how to sort of reconnect people in this car park, or transform the car park into something which connected people in with this deeper history and where things were. And this group of students came up with a very different idea, and it was really around about how to set up these container units so that people could come in and use them to make things and sort of generate a kind of economic around this site, because the site was also being within the old walls of Nicosia. It was predominantly a very large refugee community that lived there with young kids and so on. And this was picked up by the other group who were interested in thinking about, well, that they could transform the whole car park into a soccer field, and this could be something that really worked at the reunification of Nicosia by inviting different young people to play in teams, and they were thinking about how you might design a uniform and so on in order to do that. And then we did a workshop with the kids that were around, who lived around this area, and asked them to, well, here behind us is the propositions from our students in the workshop, and then we invited the children to also think about the future of this space. And so they were here making drawings and so on, and then we put them up beside the students' work in the car park. And so, this was just really a way of sort of thinking about the question of urban interiority is not just a kind of coming up with a design proposition, but also how to sort of involve those who are there. And, I really like how the dog sort of, is part of it all. And this young girl's pointing out to her brother, like, where the proposition is for the soccer field is going to go. And there's a group photo of them all. Yeah, so this idea of interiority in the city, it's kind of something that I think a lot of people are starting to think about, and coming from different practices and concerns. This one's a seminar in Yale and in the States, and then there's Spatial Future, Urban Futures Complex Interiority. It's a workshop or a seminar that was held in Hong Kong. I'd just like to go into the studio, if that's okay, for 5 minutes. Can I just go a bit longer, Zena? Is that all right? Thank you. So this is the project design studio that we're working on at the moment, and I have a group of 24 students, and there's 11 online and 13 that are here, and this is Melbourne, and the main kind of street that goes up Melbourne. And I'll talk about this black and white building just at the end, because that's a fairly significant building in terms of thinking about this question of urban interiority. And I guess, like, this is just pre-COVID. There's lots of, festivals, and people are amazing, like, just do all these crazy things. And then, sort of COVID hit, and it was just really the city, which is sort of very strongly in Melbourne. It's a residential city, and, shops and lots of tourism, and approximately 17% of the residents in the inner city of Melbourne are international students. And so Australia has had its borders closed to anyone coming in, and it's been terrible, because we haven't been able to welcome our international students back into RMIT or into any other universities around Australia. And Melbourne's been really, really hard hit. And I guess there's all these statistics here. The City of Melbourne, who is a partner now with our studio, and there's just kind of all this, lots of money, jobs, no tourism, all of this is what was happening last year, and it's really slowly coming into recovery now. And anyway, so we're partnered up with the City of Melbourne, and with a proposition around interior design as a practice in the urban environment can respond and assist, the City of Melbourne in terms of how it's going to really open out and encourage the city to start to flourish. And in the very first class, students were just asked to make a drawing of their city. And so Jessica, this is her drawing of Melbourne. And I'm just kind of there saying that Melbourne is not just the monuments and the built fabric, but it's also all the people. And then there's a very interesting one here from Ivy. And this is just in the first week. So it's before we started thinking about anything. And this was, you know, Ivy really identifying the kind of criticality of time for her in terms of her relationship with Melbourne. So not just past, present, and future, but also different moments in time. So what we've moved on to is thinking about, like, well, what are urban subjects? You know, like, we're talking about urban interiority, then in terms of thinking about urban subjects, and that's not the same thing as, you know, people, but demographics and data produces urban subjects. So you have things like workers and tourists and residents and so on. And so we've just been collecting that together. And Alyssa's done this great diagram, you know, looking at not only time frames, because Melbourne's a very, you know, it was colonized 200 years ago, and before that it's been 40,000 years of Indigenous peoples living here. And so we have a very complex urban fabric for that reason, and very interesting. And just as, you know, like, you don't need to be able to read all this detail, but this is from Laverne, and just a sense of how we're starting to kind of think about and work through what an urban subject could be. And this is Jessica again, and just one of her diagrams. And I think it's, you know, like, just the invitation to students to think about what an urban, and how is an urban subject, and through the studio to be experimenting with this. And so she's sort of identified this kind of urban actions as being a key thing for urban subjects, and thinking about urban routines and events and people. So this is the City of Melbourne, and this is from the presentation that the City of Melbourne gave to our students. And it's just interesting, they use the term urban choreography. And you can just sort of see up the top here, like, this was 1836 with the city block plan, and then 19th century. So just this division of space that happened through the colonial occupation of the city, and how it started to organise the space. Indigenous peoples had a very different relationship to space, and it was much more one about a sense of sort of movement and the temporal aspect of inhabitation. Aboriginal Indigenous peoples, it's kind of, you don't have past, present, future as separate things. It's all present, and, you know, like, continuous. And so it's quite interesting to bring this in. So here, you know, Melbourne's got this very strong colonial grid that organises it. And so in our studio, you know, we're sort of thinking, well, what other, you know, as spatial kind of designers might we start to think about? This is a great diagram of Melbourne by Alyssa. And this is a heat map then, you know, like, starting to sort of think about, well, what other aspects are here in the city? I'll just flick through them because I know that it's running out of time a little bit, but these kind of great drawings by, you know, this Ivy. So, you know, one has this sense of the grid and intensities, and then, but moving out to thinking about the idea of actually sort of what a situation is. So a tram passing by, that there's movement. And I've really asked students to think about the city first and foremost as flux and flow of energy, of time, thinking time not as abstract time, like clocks and history, but time as change. It's a little bit like an oceanic sense of how we're immersed in that. And then how we might start to kind of spatialize from there as a key strategy of the studio. Sorry, that's just, Laverne did a sort of nice derive, a bit like a situationist derive. So this is just where we're at the moment, and just in phase 2, and just thinking about a new urban interiority as a proposition, and that itself is an interior design approach, thinking about this kind of question of interiority. Yeah, and they're working together in groups, and with this idea of really thinking about a designing the world that they're compelled to share, I think is, you know, it's so wonderful working with students. I'm just going to wave at the lights again. Students, because, you know, like they will be designing for the next 50, or you know, listening will be designing for hopefully for the next 50, 60 years. And it's really thinking about this future. And certainly the City of Melbourne want to think about the next 100 years. And so that when people look back from 100 years, then they go, okay, this is what they did at this time after the pandemic. And, you know, that people think that was, you know, a good thing to do. So just coming back as an ending, so towards, you know, Guattari's points again, and this is a recent book chapter that I've written that hasn't come out yet, but just really trying to sort of think through this idea of the proposition, his proposition of the subjective city. And I think it comes in some ways, again, back to this figure that you saw at the very beginning in the City of Melbourne. So this is a building, and at different angles, it just looks like a black and white building, because the white is like the facade of the building or the balconies. And then the black area is, you know, sort of the back of the balcony and the windows leading into apartments. This is by Ashton Raggett McDougall. And you can sort of, it's nice, this is also RMIT here where I'm sitting sort of just about there at the moment. But it's all, you know, the figure is actually an Indigenous elder, William Barrack, and who was, you know, a key figure in terms of the city through the early 1800s. And so I think that's kind of interesting that they've sort of brought this figure out in terms of the city. They're fairly, Ashton Raggett McDougall, fairly provocative architects, but it's sort of making this kind of this presence, a critical presence within the urban fabric. So this is my last slide. And I think the thing here is like we're moving, you know, like, well, just coming back to where we began with, but it's really sort of moving from this idea of thinking interior space and container to an idea of infrastructure and time and spatial temporal relations and a kind of physical ecology. I think this is really sort of kind of critical in relationship to how we can transform our relationship, well, transform how, you know, we inhabit cities. And also the move from interiority as individual and psychological. I mean, there's a much bigger sort of philosophical theoretical kind of critique here, and I would also add phenomenological here, and also this kind of human-centric aspect that we have about cities, to thinking about mental and social ecologies and human and non-human and the subjective city. So these are really kind of ideas that are there as kind of provocations and to experiment with, because it's you know, like it's the idea of experimentation is intrinsic to the ethics of how we, you know, work with urban interiority. It's not coming up with an identity for that and fixing on that, because that in itself is problematic. But instead, it is to be thinking about, you know, if we're talking about ecologies, then an ecology, it's not like a green ecology. I mean, even though it's part of that. But it's this idea that it's a system and it's relational, and it's like this idea of the infrastructure. It's kind of dynamic and changing. And how do we work in this dynamic and changing kind of ecology? I think is really critical. And from an interior design point of view, you know, the interiorizations, the designing interiors that we produce, and that produces, you know, exteriors as well, and how we sort of are and see in the world. Yeah, so thank you. And just the last point is like the books on the side. You know, Jan Gehl is kind of really well known for talking about cities for people, and he's done a lot of work in Melbourne as well. But it's kind of, you know, there's a sort of implied transition here from sort of not just thinking about cities for people anymore. It's kind of thinking about cities for human, non-human, you know, this idea of a city as a kind of subjective city and what that means, and moving to spatial practices, this idea of, you know, interiority as being something it's not just about a person, it's actually something much kind of, yeah, more encompassing. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
So stop sharing,
yeah.
Open it up to some questions.
You can write in the QA part, or you can raise your hand to we can hear your voice to get the microphone. Thank you, Suzie, for this enlightening and stimulating presentation with very interesting images, examples. I think it should have made the audience really think about different ways of approaching the notion of interiority and questioning boundaries between urban and interior, if any, and also questioning about extending the boundaries of the discipline. I'd like to give the word to our audience and check the question and answer part, QA part, or you can raise your hand. Okay, so the first question is from Ece Kişioğlu. She says, I wonder about projects where we break the boundaries of the exterior and interior spaces. What are the materials we can use to reflect the exterior in the interior? Or vice versa.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, you know, like in terms of breaking the boundaries of exterior and interior spaces, just to address that first. So often we think about, and, you know, like these are really ideas that are very ingrained in the way that we think. And it's kind of a challenge to think differently. But I suppose the idea of interior and exterior, we often tend to think of that spatially. And so, you know, I'm sitting here and I'm inside this building and outside is the exterior. And, you know, so breaking that boundary in some kind of way. But the proposition that I'm coming from is not to have that kind of a binary or a dialectical kind of position, if that makes sense. So, you know, it's not interior, exterior as an either or kind of situation, but rather it's to think, and this is coming from a sort of philosophical kind of position, and the particular philosophers and things like Deleuze, it's this idea is that we're always in an exteriority, an exterior, and what we do is actually produce interiors in an exterior. And so it's kind of this process of interiorization. So to try to sort of, I guess, make that not so kind of complex, perhaps, but, you know, like just, I guess, sitting here in this room, right, there's this interior that for me, you know, like I understand it in particular ways because, you know, I have a habitual relationship to it. But I think there's probably a little spider up there in the corner, and it's up there, and that's its interior, and all of this that I'm sitting in is its exterior, right? And, you know, like, so interior and exterior have this kind of dynamic with them as being kind of, say, more like a condition, slightly different from inside and outside. And, you know, like the spider up in the corner, like in its web, will have all these, its arrangements, its spider web, as a way, you know, that's its world. And, you know, like here I am sort of making a lot of noise. I don't even know if spiders can hear, but it'll sort of have a very different view of what's happening in the rest of this space here. And like from an interior design point of view, you know, like I could transform what's here into something completely different again by, you know, I could build a way of sort of being closed in this space, and this would then make this out here, out the exterior and outside. So it's a bit more of a dynamic condition in that way. But I mean, coming back to your question, you know, like, so it's just moving away from this idea of exterior and interior spaces as a sort of thing that we start with to break the boundary. And, but there's, you know, I think there's lots of really great materials that to reflect and make that sort of boundary dynamic. Coming back to Walter Benjamin, apparently, I think, you know, like, or maybe it was Freud, but, you know, there used to be mirrors, like just sitting on the outside that would reflect that outside inside, you know, so there's some interesting plays there. But yeah, this kind of boundary with interior and exterior rather than thinking about that space. And I guess I just, not wanting to talk about what I've done all the time, but like there's a conference that I convened with a friend of mine, Ginny, and it was called Inside Out. And we brought interior and landscape people together, and we deliberately took architecture out because we wanted the middle bit, like not to be there as a kind of, and there's nothing, like it was just, again, an experiment. But just to go, well, what kind of conversation can we have as interior designers and landscape architects if there's no defining kind of wall or definition between us in a way, like coming back to that interior-exterior space. And so, in the end, there was lots of architects there and we had a really interesting discussion. But it's, it's just asking these questions.
Thank you. There is a hand I see, Begüm Önal. Can we give the... Okay, Begüm, you can...
Hello.
Turn.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, good morning to all and good evening to you again, dear Suzie Attiwill. Thank you for being with us today. It was such an insightful seminar, and I was also very delighted to see my ex-advisor, Davide Fassi, and projects developed in Milan. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned about the multidimensional cartographies for the production of subjectivity and making new relations with the world around us. I'm totally in with this rhizomic third of Guattari and Deleuze that breaks the boundary between the material and immaterial. In a time where the relationship between human and non-human agencies has been heavily affected and transformed with COVID-19, how do you think the production process of urban subjects through interiority will change, considering that we will somehow have the residual COVID-19 fears probably a few more years, even if the pandemic ends?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I suppose, that's really something that's kind of critical to be posing. And again, this idea of experimentation, and like you've mentioned, Deleuze and Guattari, so sort of appreciate the criticality of experimenting, on ourselves rather than sort of having a kind of idea that we're going to come up with solutions and so on. Mm-hmm. And I think this residue, as you put it, which is an interesting thing, like that we're all going to have residues of COVID in us and a kind of fear through that, and the effect that has had in terms of the social relations between people, the impact of all of that. But I think what you've identified like a key aspect that we've really got to be sort of thinking about, and how we can change that and transform it and experiment with it. And I'm sort of hoping that in the studio that we're looking at, that the next stage will be a series of propositions specifically for the city of Melbourne. Mm-hmm. And that through that there will be ways of bringing people together to participate in very new ways with the urban fabric, and that will hopefully mean that those kinds of fears and concerns will be will be lifted, but at the same time people will still be able to practice things that do attend to looking after themselves. It's really really interesting time, isn't it? Because I just want everybody to practice ways of being in the social realm that looks after everyone and not just themselves, so that they kind of, in terms of COVID, that means maybe wearing masks, or in Melbourne it's sort of that's starting to change, but just kind of being thoughtful, and how the effect and impact that you have on others is something that one considers. And again, this is what Guattari talks about a lot, mm-hmm. that there's not really any kind of neutrality that we can go to, and we shouldn't, and people have, around how we can sort of cure things well, he would talk about, schizoid states and so on, but instead we've got to think about the relational aspects and how do we do things and attend things in an ethical way. And I think that's probably what comes, as a response to what you've raised, is how do we practice and act ethically within the urban realm.
Mm. Yeah.
And that's as we live. So coming back to living, and so new modes of living, it's having to change those, I think.
Yeah.
Rethink those, experiment with those.
Indeed, yeah. Thank you.
A new question in the chat part. Ecehan Kıvılcım says she's very glad to see you here, and thanks. She asked, is urban interiors, is it just a discursive construction, or does it propose a new methodology? She means, is it something discursive or methodological? What are the tools of the methodology? If so, are we adapting the methodologies of interior design to urban design, or does it include more?
Oh, I think, it's, well, it's certainly the methodologies of interior design, the techniques. I prefer techniques rather than methodologies. The kind of attitude, the way of thinking, the values, and extending those into the urban realm, not as urban design, but as interior design practice. That's a key thing. But it's kind of interesting because interior design is a really expansive practice in lots of ways, and that's why I like to keep coming back to this idea of what is the relation of people to their environments and how we address that. But I think for me the questions are more with interior design are more sort of philosophical questions rather than methodological. I think methodological comes in after, and certainly with my own research, it's been much more about having to open out and think about other kinds of ways of thinking about people's relation with their surroundings and the phenomenological, because I sort of, I just think that with interior design practice, like this idea of the sort of person and the individual at the sort of center of the interior designer's focus and how to move out from that is problematic. So it's not like I've got a set of methodologies that counter that. It's more coming from a philosophical position to open it out and explore it in other ways. I'm not answering that very well, but it's really, so it's kind of methodological in the sense of moving from going, okay, this is person and human centric, and this idea of working from the inside out, which is a really sort of common way of talking about interior design practice. Instead, for me, it's thinking about interior as a relational condition, so therefore it's always interior and exterior dynamics, and it's not then about the person. It's like psychology and things. It's thinking about the design comes strongly to the fore, and as a designer, how can one practice and what can one do? I don't need to become a psychologist or to understand psychology in order to do this practice of interior design as one that's concerned with thinking about interior exterior dynamics, and in that, like the techniques that are there around space and time and materiality, those kinds of things. Because it's a good question.
New questions, right? From Ilnet Abdo, asking about the Australia case. Are there currently any regulation in Australia that encourage making urban dwellers active subjects within the produced spaces in the urban environment? What kind of analysis are to be taken for such space making? Are cultural studies also included? Asking.
Yeah. And what does it mean by any regulation? Like sort of preventing people or encouraging people?
Would you like to take the microphone? Or?
I can just answer in different ways. I mean, I think that there's various different projects that are done by the City of Melbourne, and particularly one at the moment, which is one of the ones that they're using to try and bring people back into the city, and that's called Off the Grid. It's a laneway. We've got many laneways in Melbourne that are sort of come off that grid, and were service laneways and cut-throughs and back laneways. And so there's a curated art project that's working with the laneways, invited artists to come in and do things in the laneways, and then that involves often involves participants and things of people who are in the city. I think that so there's a lot of sort of I'm not sure I'm getting your question though, like, because it seems like as urban dwellers to actually produce spaces in the urban environment. It'd be good to hear what you mean by that, rather than just participating in something. Is it sort of around space making? Because there are lots of projects that artists and designers do, and they involve participatory installations and so on. But at the moment, there's probably not like residents and so on making buildings or dwellings in a sense. I think there's probably a number of gardens that urban dwellers are involved with, and there's certainly lots of communities of people. And this is a bit pre-COVID in Melbourne, and they're probably kind of coming back because they're sort of roots up, but yeah.
Yeah, so not a top-down approach, but more of a grassroots approach.
Yeah,
to transform public space.
Yeah, well, the City of Melbourne's really in this in the pandemic kind of period of time has been thinking very hard about how to bring people back in, and so like there's lots and lots of restaurants in the City of Melbourne, and they've closed off car parks and things to make them into spaces that people can, restaurants can move out into and have outdoor dining and so on. And so, they're trying lots of small scale experiments, I think, at the moment. But it's still fairly new. I mean, people have only been coming back into the City of Melbourne, if they weren't living here already, but coming back into work since February this year.
Yeah, there are new questions. I'd like to combine two questions in the chat part. One from Merve Çelebi and one from Sergio Tadonio. Merve asks, would you suggest new openings for architectural, landscape architecture, and interior architecture educations for the sake of blurring the boundaries? And Sergio Tadonio, he also defines urban interiority and asks about, is the academy currently rethinking about the strict separation between these two design programs, architecture and interior design, in consideration of these fundamental new issues? And I also would like to add his second question, but you already covered most. He asked, are those issues of urban interiority having an impact on formal urban policies? Yeah.
Okay. In terms of policies, no, I don't think so, not yet. But I mean, that's the intention and the aim. I'm not sure what's happening, whether internationally, because it's really a growing interest in this idea of urban interiority that's kind of coming from, not just from what I've been doing, people are sort of developing their own kinds of interests and things, and in the States and so on. So there could be some work that's happening there around policy. But I mean, that's the intention, I think, you know, like that's why I wanted to partner up with the City of Melbourne, and so that they can see what this potential is. And, you know, that's a little bit of a struggle, you know, like to have councils involved in thinking, well, interior design, isn't that just kind of decoration and, you know, like whatever, like there's perceptions of that in Australia a bit, but it's like really bringing it into their realm, so they start to see the kind of potential and the knowledge base that gets brought with that. In terms of, you know, so the intent is that, you know, it starts to come into policy in some kinds, in many kinds of ways. And I think that's just with interior design a little bit more generally in relationship to the knowledge that and the ways of working, say, with learning environments. And I'm doing quite a bit of work with people or just around autistic kind of engagements with cities and things too. So there's, you know, like it's all sort of linked in many ways. I just didn't have time to talk about these things. With actually how it works in universities and, you know, the relationship between architecture and interior design. And I guess it really depends in different universities have in Australia. One of the things that a lot of universities, and it's a very different kind of situation, because from what I understand in Turkey and other, you know, like some of the Northern European areas, like use of the term interior architect is used as a, you know, is kind of different to how it's being used in Australia. So interior programs in Australia are university ones. Most of them have now called themselves interior architecture. And we're the only probably university, there are other sort of providers, but a university that's stuck with the word interior design, and for the reasons that I've mentioned. The problem with using the word interior architect in Australia is that you have to have the registration of an architect to call yourself an interior architect. And so there's this sort of relationship between interior programs and architecture programs that's kind of a little bit fraught. But here at RMIT, you know, we have a really great school which has architecture, landscape architecture, and interior design. And we are 3 separate disciplines within the School of Architecture and Urban Design. And yeah, you know, like I think because we're also in a School of Architecture and Urban Design is like the 3 areas are also having this relationship with urban in different ways. And that probably reflects what's happening at RMIT more broadly. And our relationship to architecture is, you know, like there's a sort of a distinctiveness that's understood about these different practices that's recognised. That doesn't happen in necessarily other universities, where using the term interior architecture, you know, they're seen to be specialists of architecture and therefore, you know, quite often get taken into the architecture department. Whereas we've been able to, yeah, sort of really thrive. Interior design at RMIT has been here for 80 years. So we're the oldest program. And yeah, there's just been a lot of really interesting, you know, people doing some good things. What was the very first part of the question? There's lots of questions in that.
So I think you covered it all. Okay. We're asking about the educational perspective. There is I see a new hand from Sahar Asadollahi. Would you like to take the microphone?
Thank you so much. First, I would like to thank you, Professor Attiwill. It's really great chance for me to just be here. And then, and thanks to Yashar University and Zainab Tuna Olta for organizing all this. My question is about how you see the impact of looking at interiority in the context of urban in the publicity of these places? I mean, do you see any correlation between this dynamic and the dynamic between the perception of users in public and privateness of these places?
Yeah, sorry, and just say the first part of that again.
The impact of looking in this like entirety in the context of urban. Yeah.
Well, I guess the first move to make is not to refer to people as users, so that it's kind of just starting to really kind of recalibrate how we think about kind of people in the urban environment. And it's sort of moving towards, well, what it's making this proposition is around the production of subjectification. And that's kind of, again, it's drawing on Guattari, and it's not like there's, we can do that and then it's different from what we have. It's actually just a way, a new lens, a way of looking at actually what happens. And, like the production of subjectification, one, we've got to just kind of think, well, that we're not just talking about people and a person, but we're talking about this idea of a subject and subjectification. And, to realize that, understand that happens all the time already. And so what I was getting back to at the beginning and talking about capitalism, I don't have a big beef about capitalism, but it's just interesting as a kind of way of, well, maybe I do, but, like this sense of, okay, well, everyone's a consumer in the city. And, when the lockdown finished, it was like all over the news. It was like, okay, everybody can go shopping now. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted to go shopping. And so, there's this sense that that's that kind of production of subjectification. It's like, it's kind of the social, cultural, historical forces that make everybody think that they want to go shopping, and that's a way to celebrate being out of lockdown, is to go and buy and consume things. And, it's linked very much into sort of significant economic issues and social issues and so on. But, so people, that's a production of subjectification for people to sort of see themselves as that. And it's, so it can be, in many ways, like something that can really be quite a sort of dominant, forceful, manipulative kind of process. And politically we see that, and, in various different cultures and so on. But it's kind of, it's not agreeing with the idea that, well, we're just all free and we can just do whatever we want to do. It's actually recognizing that this happens at this kind of level. And so therefore, how can, as designers, can we enter into that and intervene into this and produce the potentiality of other productions of subjectivity, subjectification? And I think, that's where this kind of question of urban interiority comes into play in terms of posing that. And so just, this idea of the user, which we all kind of often refer to in relationship to design, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because, people, the idea of somebody using the design of what we've done. But if we start to think, well, how else could they be thought in relationship to how they engage with what we do? And this is where it starts to open out onto other ideas of other kinds of urban subjects. And I mean, there's a article that was written by Manfredo, I can't remember his last name, I can give it to Zainab, but where he sort of puts together this idea of sort of the consumer is also a producer, so that you don't, like in this hybrid kind of urban subject. So you don't just have a consumer, but they're a producer. All of a sudden that kind of goes, oh, that's interesting. Like, what are they doing and how are they doing it? So it's like from a design point of view, it's having that as a proposition and sort of seeing how you can transform this idea of the sort of lives and how people engage. And it's a bit controversial, and I don't have any answers, but, for example, like the homeless, I mean, that's another kind of production of subjectification. It's not because that person has produced that, it's the environment, it's the social, it's the economic, and, so we have homeless, and it's the question then becomes, well, rather than dealing with just the individual and what you can do there, so there's something else, can other things change within the urban environment that just renders that as not a condition, not a state.
Thank you, Suzie. I think it should have answered the question. So there are two more questions I'd like to take. I don't want to stop, but we are approaching the end of our session. One is by Osman Demirbaş. Osman Hocam, would you like to take the microphone? Yeah.
Hi, Osman. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm unmuted right now, I guess. Hi, Suzie. I didn't notice who am I. I'm from IFI Osman. It's great to see you here. Welcome again. Although it's a virtual environment, but it's great to see you with us. Thank you for this beautiful and very exciting presentation. It has been more than a year right now after we had this great workshop in Dubai. Always really very exciting and enjoyable to just listen what you are just saying. It was lovely. Actually, everything has been covered. I just want to say hello to you, and just to make some kind of a contribution, maybe. Let me just ask a very speculative question. The thing is, actually, you have covered all of the things. Specifically, I really want to thank you about underlining the thing about looking from inside out kind of thing, and the human-centered approach and the notion of interior design. That's very important, because unfortunately it's a common thing all around the world, but in Turkey we're living this thing more. We're experiencing this misunderstanding more because of the ontology of the word interior. The interior design directly makes people think about inside of a box. However, from your presentation, it's so obvious that actually it's from inside out. So it's more related with the human or the user itself and the environment of the user itself. In that sense, actually, 10 years ago, when we were working on this Interiors Declaration of IFI in New York City, I just opened up a discussion related with the language changes.
Yeah, so, I remember.
Do you remember that? I don't know, but
I do.
Actually, I like this terminology, interiority. It's very specific and it's very to the point. Unfortunately, in our language, there is no translation for interiority. Also, there is no exact translation for the word interior. So the Turkish word for interior is not fulfilling the concept of interior design, interior architecture. Anyway, let me just wrap up. So my question is that in the 2nd century of the defined profession of interior design, interior architecture, why I'm saying 2nd century, because as a defined profession, we can say that it's almost 100 years old. I mean, it's more than 100 years old, but the professional definition is right now in its 2nd century. Do you think that we need a redefinition for interior design, interior architecture? Do we need to make a definition about the action, what we are doing professionally? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Osman. That's another big question to, and I do remember that conversation in New York, just around how in Turkish there's no interior or equivalent for interior, and I suppose yeah, that's made me think a lot, because, you know, for me, it's a kind of really key word, and just recognizing that, yeah, if it's, and I guess I like to work with it kind of conceptually as well. So it becomes a problem. I mean, it's the same in Chinese, in Mandarin as well. I think, you know, it's sort of, there's something that's implicit in the use of the characters that sort of make it inside a sort of house or a building. And yeah, and I've often thought about emailing you just to kind of check this out, but I don't know, like, I think that, I think there's two things in there, like, so that in terms of the profession and the discipline, yeah, maybe, I mean, it'd be interesting to think what other terms there could be. And I guess I just wanted to clarify that I'm a little, you know, I'm more from the outside in rather than the inside out. So, you know, like, I think that's the strength for me of interior design, is that it's like, it's kind of, you know, like, in fact, I mean, this is where I get very broad, but everything, I think, is in a sense an interior design that people do, because it's the only way we inhabit the world that we're in. So architecture is interior design for me, because, you know, it provides a way of sort of inhabiting and living in the world. And so it's not this idea of sort of the inside out for me, which then really implicates a human-centric position. I think we've got to move away from that. I think that's caused, you know, significant issues, like the spider up here would probably be telling me that if it could talk, you know, like, and I think, you know, it's moving away from this anthropocentric position and also from the psychological position. And you know, I often think of Sashi Khan and her book on rethinking interior design, and she calls for a science of human experience. So she's very, you know, like, we're at different positions in relationship to that, because, you know, she sees things as being quite psychological, and that we can somehow have a science around that. But, you know, I think it's really more like that we're always this thing of interiorizing, you know, like we're in exteriors, and it's the interiorization that becomes the critical thing rather than the movement outwards. But yeah, I don't know, come up with some new type, you know, it'd be interesting to think what else you'd call this practice as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
It's good to see you. Bye.
Yeah. I keep looking down at the speaker, because that's where I think you are, because I don't see you there. It's funny, isn't it? Hopefully we'll see each other again sometime soon.
Yeah.
In real life.
I hope so.
Yeah.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I'd like to take the last question from Halis Arda Özdemir. How do you preserve the character of the spaces in your indoor-outdoor designs that you want to operate integrated? Where do you restrict them, especially in public buildings, so that they are two independent spaces that work together rather than appear as parts of a whole?
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah. I guess, you know, the question is like, why do you want to preserve them in a way? And like, and it comes back to this indoor-outdoor designs. And I'm sort of talking more about kind of a condition of interior and exteriority, which is, you know, not the equivalent of indoor and outdoor, I think. And, you know, I just think in a public building, and this is another interesting term, is like public, and what does public mean these days? And the public-private dichotomy, it's a bit like the interior-exterior dichotomy, is really transformed. And I mean, I think we've got to put into all of this, you know, the digital technologies and the virtual, because, you know, this idea of the physical space defining the indoor and outdoor kind of dimensions is, or the interior and exterior, is really, challenged, I think, by the fact that this notion of what interior can be or is, when we, like, I'm sitting here and here I am, I've been telling colleagues, I've got to go give a talk in Izmir, at 5:30, and they go, it's just, it's so interesting just to have this kind of very different time, space kind of ability through digital technology. So I think that's kind of the way that I respond to that. And just even with this idea of public buildings, public buildings are inherently also private in lots of ways, and with their interior-exterior dynamics, I think. Yeah. I think there's an interesting question that maybe links to this just at the end about, the semantic relation between the term public interiority and urban interiority. And, what's the relationship between them? And I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, it just makes me think about perhaps there's somebody that's written quite a bit on this idea of public interiority, academic in the United States called Liz Teston. And she's developed this idea of public interiority as a way of how to have an interiority in a public realm. And it's, like the focus for her around interiority is still with this kind of idea of the individual within the public realm and how to work with that. And then there's people like Richard Sennett, who's done an interesting talk on interiors and interiority. And again, it's from my point of view, there's a maintenance of the idea of interiority as individual subjectivity that's inherent there. Whereas urban interiority, with the use of the term urban, means that it's an interiority which is not necessarily defined as individual person, but is a kind of question of the urban realm. And it's like the term subjective city. It's like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean for a city to have a subjectivity? And as Guattari would say, urban mentality. So it's not being posed at people at all in a way. And I think it's just that's with urban interiority, it's kind of in that direction more than thinking, well, it's just about people and their subjectivities. Yeah. There's lots of good questions. Thanks. I'm just looking at all that.
Thank you, Suzie. Thanks to our audience who asked these very good questions. I'd like to close this session. I'd like to thank you again for this wonderful presentation. I think the audience, our students, are now more questioning about the boundaries, territories, limits as you defined between private domains, urban domains, realms, private, especially today in the pandemic world, more about domestic domains. So thank you again. This is our present, a small thank you from Yaşar University that a sapling has been planted in your name in the forest, commemorative forest of the university. We will send it via the email. Thank you again. I hope we can come together.
Yeah. What kind of sapling? What sort of species tree?
Oh, honestly speaking, I'm not quite sure.
I'll have to come and find it.
I will give you.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great. I've really enjoyed it. And it's been great to, I think that the kind of main thing is to have all this discussion and to have good questions and to, to really have to think hard about all of these things. And that in itself is productive and important. So thank you very much for that opportunity.
Thank you. I hope we'll meet soon again.
Yeah.
Hopefully face to face. But
yeah. All right. Thank you. Thanks very much, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good evening to you. And
thank you.
Good afternoon.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.